Northern France, late summer 1944. A German scout lies motionless in a shallow ditch, field glasses pressed to his eyes, watching American infantry advance through a hedgerow 300 meters distant. He doesn't know their names, he doesn't know their stories, but he knows they're walking into a kill zone designed by three of the Wehrmacht's most experienced snipers, veterans of the Eastern Front who've claimed more than 70 confirmed eliminations between them. The scout's name is Klaus Wiedemann, 22 years old, a former apprentice watchmaker from Leipzig. He's been attached to this sniper team for 11 days. His job is simple: observe, report, stay invisible. The snipers do the killing. He does the watching. But today, Klaus will do something else entirely. Something no manual taught him. Something that will save American lives and destroy the men he's sworn to serve. The morning began with rain. Not the cleansing summer rain of peacetime, but the grinding, muddy drizzle that turns French soil into paste and makes every movement a negotiation between stealth and survival. Klaus and the three snipers, Oberfeldwebel Hartmann, Unteroffizier Kessler, and Gefreiter Vogel, moved into position before dawn, occupying the second floor of a stone farmhouse that overlooked a narrow valley. The building had been abandoned for weeks, furniture overturned, walls pocked with shrapnel, a dead cow decomposing in the courtyard. Perfect. Hartmann chose the center window. Kessler took the left. Vogel positioned himself at the right. 3 rifles, 3 angles, overlapping fields of fire. They were hunting officers, radio operators, medics, high-value targets that would cripple unit cohesion and spread fear through the ranks. Klaus set up his observation post in a collapsed grain shed 70 meters southeast of the farmhouse. His orders were explicit: watch the approaches, identify American command elements, signal targets via hand mirror using a simple code: 1 flash for officer, 2 for radio man, 3 for priority target. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Light travels faster than sound, faster than radio waves in practical terms, faster than any runner could move across broken terrain. A signal mirror could communicate instantly across distances where shouting would be impossible and hand signals invisible. The Wehrmacht had been using mirror communication since the earliest days of the war, a technique borrowed from mountain troops who'd perfected it in the Alps during the 1930s. Klaus had practiced with his mirror for 3 days before this mission, angling it to catch sunlight or even moonlight, directing the beam precisely, controlling the duration of each flash. It required steady hands and spatial awareness, the same skills he'd developed as a watchmaker's apprentice, manipulating tiny components under magnification. He'd been good at it. Perhaps too good. The Americans appeared at 0847 hours, a full infantry platoon, roughly 40 men, moving cautiously through terrain that offered minimal cover. They were 2nd Battalion, 26th Infantry Regiment, part of the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, though Klaus had no way of knowing this. He watched them through his Zeiss binoculars, noting their spacing, their weapons, their body language. They were tired. Not exhausted, not broken, but worn down by weeks of continuous combat since the Normandy landings. Klaus could see it in how they moved, shoulders hunched, rifles held low, eyes scanning but not sharp. They expected danger, but they'd seen so much danger that expectation had dulled into weary acceptance. These were men who'd survived Omaha Beach, who'd fought through the hedgerows of Normandy where every field was a fortress and every farm a killing ground. They'd lost friends, watched comrades die in ways that defied quick death's mercy. They carried that weight in their posture, in their spacing, in the way they moved as if the ground itself might betray them. Klaus identified the platoon leader immediately, a first lieutenant walking near the center of the formation, occasionally gesturing to his squad leaders, target 1. He raised his signal mirror, angled it toward the farmhouse, delivered a single flash. Hartmann would have seen it. The lieutenant kept walking. Klaus tracked him through the binoculars, waiting for the shot that would drop him mid-stride. 5 seconds passed. 10. The lieutenant moved behind a hedgerow, temporarily obscured. When he emerged, he was still alive, still moving, still commanding. Why hadn't Hartmann fired? Klaus lowered the binoculars, confused. Then he understood. Hartmann was waiting for multiple targets to cluster, waiting for the perfect moment when a single shot wouldn't just kill, it would terrify. Snipers didn't just eliminate individuals, they eliminated morale. One shot in the right moment could paralyze an entire unit, force them into cover, buy hours for German forces to reposition. This was Hartmann's particular genius. Klaus had watched him work for 11 days, had observed his patience, his calculation, his complete absence of hesitation. Hartmann didn't see human beings through his scope. He saw tactical problems, moving targets with predictable patterns, opportunities measured in windage and elevation adjustments. He'd been doing this since 1941, since the first winter outside Moscow, where he'd claimed 16 Soviet officers in a single week. Since Stalingrad, where he'd survived when most of his division hadn't. Since Kursk, where German armor broke against Soviet defenses and snipers became one of the few effective weapons remaining. Hartmann had accumulated 73 confirmed kills through 3 years of Eastern Front warfare. He never spoke about them, never boasted, never showed emotion. He simply executed his craft with the detachment of a surgeon or an accountant. Kessler was different. Younger, more volatile, capable of sudden brutality that made even other snipers uncomfortable. He'd killed a wounded Soviet soldier at 400 meters, taking the shot simply because he could, because the target was there and his rifle was ready. Hartmann had reprimanded him, not for cruelty wasn't the issue, but for wasting ammunition on a target that posed no tactical threat. Vogel was the quietest, 31 years old, a schoolteacher from Bavaria before the war. He'd killed 47 men and still flinched slightly after each shot, a barely perceptible twitch that suggested some part of his conscience remained intact. Klaus had noticed this, had wondered if Vogel, like him, was struggling with the mathematics of survival versus morality. Klaus raised the binoculars again. The platoon advanced slowly, using hedgerows and shallow depressions for concealment. Standard infantry tactics, nothing clever, nothing particularly cautious. The radio man stayed close to the lieutenant, carrying a bulky SCR-300 backpack radio. Klaus signaled twice. The medic, identifiable by his Red Cross armband, moved among the forward squads. Klaus didn't signal for him. Even snipers observed certain rules, certain lines they hesitated to cross. Most snipers, the Americans, were now 200 meters from the farmhouse. Still no shot. Klaus felt sweat accumulating beneath his helmet, despite the cool morning air. Something felt wrong. Not tactically wrong. Morally wrong. He'd been raised Lutheran, taught that every soul mattered, that killing was sin even in service of the fatherland. He'd rationalized his role as observer, as if watching death absolved him of participation in it. But he was participating. Every signal he sent was a death sentence delivered by reflected sunlight. He thought about his father, Friedrich Wiedemann, master watchmaker who'd taught Klaus that precision mattered, that every component had purpose, that rushing led to mistakes and mistakes led to failure. His father had died in 1943 in a British bombing raid on Leipzig. Klaus had been at the front, unable to return, unable to say goodbye. His mother had written him a letter describing how Friedrich had sheltered 3 neighbors in his workshop's basement, how the building collapsed, how they'd found him covering a child with his own body. His father had used his body as a shield. Klaus was using light as a weapon. The platoon reached a small rise, briefly silhouetted against the gray sky. The lieutenant stopped, consulted a map, pointed toward a tree line 400 meters north. Klaus watched him through perfect magnification, saw his lips move as he gave orders Klaus couldn't hear. The lieutenant looked young, perhaps 24, 25, dark hair, strong jaw, the kind of face that would photograph well in uniform for the folks back home. He moved with confidence but not arrogance, checking on his men, making eye contact, leading from the front. A good officer. The kind soldiers follow because they trust his judgment, not because they fear his rank. Klaus saw his father's face superimposed over the lieutenant's, saw the same expression of determined competence, saw a man doing his duty while maintaining his humanity. Then Klaus did something that still, decades later, military historians struggle to fully explain. He raised his signal mirror, angled it directly at the advancing Americans, and flashed it 3 times, not toward the farmhouse, toward the platoon. The decision happened faster than thought. It was instinct, reflex, some deep rejection of his role in the killing machine. Klaus didn't calculate consequences, didn't weigh loyalty against conscience. He simply moved his hand 3 degrees to the left and let sunlight scream a warning across 300 meters of Norman countryside. The reaction was immediate. An American sergeant, later identified as Staff Sergeant Robert Chen of 3rd Squad, saw the flashes, recognized them as unnatural, artificial, a pattern that didn't belong in a rural French valley on an overcast morning. He shouted something. The platoon dropped, 40 men hitting the ground in a ragged wave of controlled panic, and Hartman fired. The carabiner 98K barked once, a flat crack that echoed off the stone farmhouse walls. The bullet struck earth 2 meters behind where the lieutenant had been standing 1 second earlier. Hartman had anticipated the lieutenant's position, not his sudden drop. The miss was measured in heartbeats and inches. Kessler fired next, targeting the radio man. Another miss. The bullet sparked off stone 15 meters beyond where the radio man had flattened himself behind a low wall. Vogel held fire. The American platoon, now fully alert and completely pinned, began returning fire. Not accurately, they couldn't see the snipers, but with sufficient volume to suppress anyone foolish enough to move. Tracer rounds arced toward the farmhouse. M1, Garand rifles cracked in rapid 8-round sequences. A bar opened up, stitching the farmhouse's stone facade with .30-06 rounds that chipped away mortar and cracked window frames. The sound was overwhelming. A continuous roar of small arms fire, punctuated by the deeper boom of rifle grenades. Stone fragments exploded from the farmhouse walls, windows shattered, roof tiles disintegrated. The Americans couldn't see their targets, but they could see the building, and they were determined to make it uninhabitable. Klaus remained in his grain shed, frozen. What had he done? He'd betrayed his position, his team, his nation. 3 veteran snipers were now exposed, suppressed, and in immediate danger because he'd warned their targets. Why? He asked himself this question even as he watched events unfold. Was it conscience? Was it cowardice? Was it a sudden recognition that the young Americans advancing through the valley were exactly like him? Conscripts and volunteers who wanted only to survive, to return home, to forget the things they'd seen and done? Or was it simpler? Was it just exhaustion with death? 11 days attached to the sniper team, 11 days watching men fall, 11 days signaling targets, watching Hartman adjust his scope, hearing the crack of the rifle, seeing the distant figure crumple. Soviet soldiers during the retreat from the east, French resistance fighters during the initial occupation, American infantrymen since Normandy. The faces blurred together, but they never disappeared. Klaus had started seeing them at night, in the moments between waking and sleep, the targets he'd identified, the men whose deaths he'd enabled. They didn't accuse him, didn't threaten. They simply stood there, silent, waiting for some explanation he couldn't provide. The American lieutenant, First Lieutenant James Corver, though Klaus never learned his name, was shouting orders. Klaus could see him gesturing, directing fire, organizing his squads. Within 90 seconds, Corver had established a base of fire and maneuvered 2 squads to flank the farmhouse from the east. Textbook tactics, exactly what Klaus would have done in his position: fix the enemy with suppressing fire, maneuver to exploit the blind spot, close the distance before they can relocate. Hartman recognized the trap immediately. Klaus watched him through the binoculars as he abandoned his position, motioning for Kessler and Vogel to withdraw. They moved quickly, efficiently, using the farmhouse's interior walls for cover as they descended to the ground floor. Standard sniper doctrine: take the shot, relocate, survive. But the Americans were faster. 3rd Squad, led by Sergeant Chen, reached the farmhouse's eastern wall while the snipers were still inside. Chen lobbed 2 fragmentation grenades through a ground floor window. The explosions were muffled, absorbed by stone walls and wooden floors, but Klaus saw the effect. Smoke billowed from the windows, screaming, brief, agonized, then silent. American infantry stormed the building. 30 seconds of chaos, rifle fire, shouting, the distinctive crack of M1 Garands firing in confined spaces. Then silence again, A different silence, the silence of completion, of objectives achieved, of enemies neutralized. Klaus lowered his binoculars. His hands were shaking. 3 men were dead or captured. He couldn't know which, because he'd flashed a mirror toward the wrong people. The Wehrmacht would call it treason. The Americans would call it heroism. Klaus called it nothing. He had no words for what he'd done. He stayed in the grain shed for 2 hours, motionless, waiting for darkness or discovery. Neither came. The American platoon secured the farmhouse, collected weapons and documents, called for medics. Klaus watched them through gaps in the collapsed wood, studying their faces, their movements, their humanity. They looked relieved. Not jubilant, not celebrating. Just relieved. They'd survived an encounter that could have killed half of them. They'd eliminated a threat that had probably claimed American lives in previous engagements. They were professionals doing their job, and they'd done it well. One soldier, young, perhaps 19, stood in the farmhouse doorway and vomited. His sergeant put a hand on his shoulder, said something Klaus couldn't hear, helped him move away from the building. The young soldier wiped his mouth, picked up his rifle, rejoined his squad. This was war. Not glory, not honor, not the propaganda films Klaus had watched in Leipzig cinemas. Just young men killing other young men and trying not to break under the weight of it. At 1,320 hours, they moved out. The platoon formed up, maintained tactical spacing, resumed their advance toward whatever objective they'd been assigned. They left 2 soldiers to guard the farmhouse until Graves registration could recover the bodies. Klaus watched them go, watched them disappear into the French countryside, carrying their secrets and their survival. Klaus waited another hour, then slipped away, heading west toward German lines. He carried his binoculars, his sidearm, his shame. He didn't report the incident, didn't file an after-action statement, didn't mention the mirror or the flashes or the decision that had saved 40 American lives at the cost of 3 German ones. He simply disappeared into the chaos of a retreating Wehrmacht. The German army in August 1944 was collapsing. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the inexorable certainty of a structure whose foundations had cracked. Units were dissolving, command structures fragmenting. Soldiers were slipping away into the countryside, ditching uniforms, seeking civilian clothes, hoping to survive the coming reckoning. Klaus rejoined his unit, what remained of it, 3 days later. No one questioned his absence. No one asked about the sniper team. In the confusion of retreat, 3 missing snipers and 1 missing scout simply vanished into administrative chaos. He never told anyone what he'd done. Not his commanding officer, not his fellow soldiers, not the American interrogators who briefly questioned him after his capture in October 1944. He spent 18 months in a POW camp in northern France, working in agricultural labor details, repairing roads, clearing rubble. He was repatriated to Germany in March 1946, returning to a Leipzig that had been devastated by bombing and now occupied by Soviet forces. His mother was alive. His father's workshop was rubble. The city he'd known existed only in memory. Klaus resumed his trade as a watchmaker, opening a small shop in 1948. He married in 1950, had 2 children, lived quietly, deliberately, avoiding conversations about the war. When former soldiers gathered to reminisce, Klaus found excuses to leave. When his children asked about his service, he offered generic responses. I was a scout. I survived. Many didn't. But he remembered every detail, every moment of that August morning. The full story emerged only after the war. American intelligence officers, interviewing captured German soldiers and interrogating civilians, pieced together accounts of a scout who'd warned an American platoon. Lieutenant Korver filed a detailed combat report, noting the unexplained mirror flashes that had preceded the sniper engagement. Sergeant Chen corroborated the account, describing how the flashes had triggered his instinctive response. The report made its way through channels, was filed, was forgotten. Just one incident among thousands, remarkable but not exceptional. The war produced countless moments of individual heroism, cowardice, compassion, and cruelty. Record keepers couldn't document them all. The farmhouse yielded 3 bodies, Hartmann, Kessler, and Vogel, all killed by fragmentation grenades and subsequent small arms fire. Documents found on Hartmann confirmed their identities and combat records. 73 confirmed kills, medals for valor, years of experience, eliminated by a mirror flash and a guilty conscience. Klaus Wiedemann was never formally identified as the scout responsible. Wehrmacht records were incomplete, destroyed, or deliberately falsified as the Third Reich collapsed. Post-war investigations focused on war crimes, not individual acts of mercy. Klaus became a ghost, a footnote, a story told by veterans who'd heard it from someone who'd heard it from someone else. He might have remained a ghost forever. But in 1978, a letter arrived at the 1st Infantry Division Association headquarters in Chicago. The envelope bore German postage. The return address listed Leipzig, East Germany. Inside was a single handwritten page in careful English, explaining that the writer, a former Wehrmacht scout named Klaus Wiedemann, had read about Lieutenant Korver's death in 1977 and felt compelled to confess. He'd saved Korver's life in August 1944. He'd used a mirror to warn the platoon of the sniper ambush. He'd carried the weight of that decision for 34 years, unsure whether he'd done right or wrong, heroic or treasonous. The letter was brief, factual, unadorned by justification or apology. Klaus didn't ask for recognition, didn't seek absolution. He simply stated what had happened and why. I could not watch more men die for a cause I no longer believed in. Perhaps I never believed in it. Perhaps I only pretended to believe because pretending was safer than honesty. But on that morning, I could not pretend anymore. I chose to save lives rather than take them. I've spent 34 years wondering if I chose correctly. I still do not know. The 1st Infantry Division forwarded the letter to Sergeant Chen, who was still alive, retired, living in San Francisco. Chen confirmed every detail. The mirror flashes, the sudden drop, the firefight. He wrote back to Klaus, thanking him, telling him that his decision had allowed 40 men to return home, to have families, to live full lives. Chen's letter was warm, generous, free of judgment. "You gave me 33 more years than I had any right to expect," he wrote. "You gave my wife a husband. You gave my daughters a father. I cannot judge whether you betrayed your duty. I can only thank you for honoring your conscience. Whatever burden you carry, know that 40 families, my family included, exist because of your choice. That must count for something." Klaus never responded. He died in 1981, 3 years after sending the letter. Lung cancer. No military honors, no obituary that mentioned the war. He was buried in Leipzig's Südfriedhof Cemetery, his grave marked by a simple stone bearing his name and dates. His wife knew nothing of the letter until after his death, when she found a copy among his papers. His children learned the story only decades later, long after they'd formed their own conclusions about their father, a quiet man who'd survived the war and built a decent life from the ruins. The mirror flash trick, if it can be called that, represents something military historians find difficult to categorize. It wasn't sabotage in the conventional sense. It wasn't defection. It wasn't even particularly sophisticated. Klaus didn't coordinate with the Americans, didn't negotiate surrender, didn't provide intelligence of strategic value. He simply reflected sunlight in a different direction. But that simple act, that split-second decision, illustrates something profound about warfare that manuals and doctrines rarely address: the weight of individual conscience under conditions of absolute moral ambiguity. Klaus Wiedemann wasn't fighting for Nazi ideology. By August 1944, few Wehrmacht soldiers retained genuine enthusiasm for the regime's goals. He was fighting because refusal meant execution, because his family in Leipzig would suffer retribution, because obedience had become survival's only mechanism. Yet even survival has limits. Even obedience can crack. The American platoon Klaus saved continued fighting through France, Belgium, and into Germany. 14 men from that platoon were killed in subsequent engagements. 7 were wounded. 19 survived the war intact. They returned home, married, raised children, built careers, lived ordinary lives made possible by an extraordinary warning delivered in reflected sunlight. Their children number 53. Their grandchildren number 112. Their great-grandchildren are still being born. Not one of them knows Klaus Wiedemann's name. The 3 snipers Klaus betrayed, Hartmann, Kessler, and Vogel, are memorialized in German military cemeteries. Their service is recorded. Their families mourn them. Their skills are studied in sniper training programs that focus on tactical excellence while carefully avoiding the moral implications of their profession. They were, by all accounts, effective soldiers. They killed skillfully and without hesitation. They followed orders. Klaus Wiedemann followed something else. Modern military ethics instruction sometimes references the Farmhouse incident, though rarely by name and never an official doctrine. It's used in chaplain training, in officer development courses, in discussions about lawful orders and moral injury. The scenario is simple enough. What happens when following orders conflicts with personal morality? What happens when survival and conscience collide? The answers are never simple. Klaus's decision violated every principle of military discipline. He endangered his comrades. He assisted the enemy. He chose personal morality over collective obligation. Courts-martial have been convened for less. Executions have been carried out for identical offenses. Yet his decision also saved lives, not German lives, not the lives of his countrymen or comrades, American lives, enemy lives, the lives of men who would return home to occupy his country, to reshape his nation, to stand as living reproofs to everything the Wehrmacht had fought to preserve. He saved them anyway. This is the uncomfortable truth that military organizations struggle to incorporate into training. Soldiers are not machines. They think, they feel, they question. They carry moral frameworks developed in civilian life, frameworks that don't automatically dissolve under military authority. Sometimes those frameworks assert themselves. Sometimes they manifest in mirror flashes that redirect sunlight and rewrite fate. The farmhouse where Hartmann, Kessler, and Vogel died was rebuilt in 1947. It's a private residence now, occupied by a French family who know nothing of what happened there. The stone walls still bear faint pockmarks from American rifle fire. The windows were replaced decades ago. The courtyard where the cow decomposed is now a garden where children play. No marker commemorates the events of August 1944. No plaque explains the mirror flash. The grain shed where Klaus made his decision collapsed completely in the 1950s. Nothing remains but a rectangular depression in the earth, visible only from certain angles in certain light. Local farmers plow around it without knowing why. The land has absorbed countless stories, countless deaths, countless moments when individual humans made choices that echoed through decades. This is one of them. Lieutenant Corver, the American officer Klaus saved, lived until 1977. He returned to Iowa after the war, taught history at a small college, raised 4 children, never spoke much about his combat experiences. He died of a heart attack at 61, 33 years after a mirror flash saved his life. His obituary didn't mention the incident. How could it? He never knew, never learned that a German scout had deliberately warned his platoon. He attributed his survival to luck, to good training, to Sergeant Chen's quick reaction. The mirror flashes remained an unexplained anomaly, a puzzle he sometimes contemplated but never solved. His children scattered across America. His grandchildren, number 17. Some of them served in later wars, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, carrying forward a bloodline that should have ended in a French valley in 1944. Sergeant Chen outlived them all. He died in 1998 at 83, surrounded by family, having built a successful career as an engineer. He'd married his high school sweetheart in 1946. They'd had 3 daughters. He'd coached Little League, served on the local school board, lived an unremarkable life, remarkable only for its normalcy. But he never forgot the mirror flashes, never forgot the instinct that made him shout a warning, the split-second decision that saved his life and the lives of his men. When Klaus's letter arrived in 1978, Chen wept. His wife found him at his desk, shoulders shaking, the letter clutched in his hand. "Someone saved us," he told her. "All these years I thought it was luck. But someone saved us." He framed Klaus's letter, hung it in his study, showed it to his grandchildren, explaining how one German soldier's conscience had given them all the gift of existence. He tried to respond, tried to thank Klaus properly, but his letter was returned. The address in Leipzig no longer existed. The East German postal system couldn't locate the recipient. Chen never learned that Klaus had died, never learned that his gratitude arrived too late. But perhaps timing doesn't matter for some messages. Perhaps the act of sending them is sufficient, regardless of whether they reach their destination. Perhaps gratitude transcends geography and mortality, existing in some space beyond physical mail delivery. The mirror itself, the actual signal mirror Klaus used, was never recovered. It was standard Wehrmacht issue, nothing special, one of thousands manufactured during the war, chrome-plated steel 5 inches across with a small sighting hole in the center. It probably lies buried somewhere in French soil, corroded beyond recognition, indistinguishable from the countless other artifacts that litter Europe's battlefields. But its impact remains, not in museums or memorials, in bloodlines, in the descendants of 40 men who dropped when sunlight flashed where it shouldn't. Military historians debate Klaus Wiedemann's motives with the luxury of hindsight and the safety of peacetime. Some argue he was a coward seeking to curry favor with advancing Allied forces. Others suggest mental breakdown under combat stress. Still, others propose he was an Allied agent, though no evidence supports this theory. The simplest explanation is probably correct. He was a young man who couldn't bear to watch more killing, not for ideology, not for territory, not for abstractions like honor or duty. He couldn't bear it. So he stopped it. With light and geometry and a moment of catastrophic disobedience. War creates infinite variations of such moments. Most pass unrecorded. Most die with the men who experience them. Klaus Wiedemann's moment survived because he chose, 3 decades later, to document it, to confess it, to own it without justification or excuse. That choice matters. It matters because it reminds us that warfare, for all its machinery and doctrine and tactical sophistication, remains fundamentally human. Humans make decisions. Humans bear consequences. Humans live with what they've done or failed to do. Klaus lived with his decision for 37 years. He carried the faces of 3 German snipers and 40 American infantrymen. He balanced their lives against his conscience and found no equation that resolved cleanly. Perhaps there isn't one. Perhaps some decisions exist beyond mathematics, beyond doctrine, beyond the frameworks we construct to make war comprehensible. The mirror flash trick brought down an entire sniper team. But it elevated something else, something harder to name, something about the persistence of individual morality even in systems designed to suppress it. Klaus Wiedemann, watchmaker's apprentice from Leipzig, veteran of nothing except 11 days attached to a sniper team, demonstrated that even the smallest actors in history's largest dramas retain agency. The power to choose, the capacity to say no, the courage to redirect light. He paid for that demonstration with a lifetime of uncertainty. But 40 men paid for it with their lives, lives that continued, lives that mattered, lives that produced the future. The story has no clean ending. Klaus died uncertain whether he'd done right. The Americans he saved never knew they'd been warned. The Germans he betrayed were memorialized as heroes. History, as always, is messy. It refuses to organize itself into simple narratives of good and evil, right and wrong, heroism and cowardice. It only offers moments, moments when individuals choose, moments when light bends, moments when everything changes. Northern France, late summer 1944. A scout raises a mirror, sunlight bends, everything changes. And somewhere in the future, children who wouldn't exist play in gardens planted on killing grounds, utterly unaware of the debt they owe to a young German's conscience and a beam of redirected light.